Немножко, ну, общество само по себе.
I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight and for the possibility to address some words to you about the present global geopolitical situation. I think we can best understand what's going on in the world today as a crisis, a geopolitical crisis of the sole superpower, the United States. It declared itself the sole superpower after the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991, as you all know. But rather soon thereafter, by the beginning of the administration of George W. Bush as president and Dick Cheney as vice president, the American power establishment, whatever name you want to give it, realized that they were coming into a deep crisis. The looting of Russia, the looting of Eastern Europe, the shock therapy, the IMF privatizations had reached a relative limit. And the looting of the Chinese economy through dirt cheap labor was also beginning to reach a limit a few years later by 2006, 2007. In my view, the rising of the average wage levels in China from the lowest levels 10, 15 years ago, by 2006, 2007 began to spell the crisis of the dollar system, which was manifested in the real estate crisis in the United States and spread very soon worldwide. In September 11th, 2001, or September 12th, President Bush declared a war on terror. He even used the expression, a new crusade, a holy crusade. Well, he quickly was told to correct his language because it would give the game away. But what in effect happened is, after 9/11, a war on Islam replaced the war against godless communism in the minds of most Americans. They had little understanding of the difference between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden in Tora Bora in Afghanistan. And they were soon willing to send their sons and daughters to die for the war on terror in Iraq and in Afghanistan. Those campaigns, however, over time proved to be a catastrophe for the United States, certainly for Afghanistan and Iraq. And to my mind, those were symptoms of the failure of neoliberalism, the failure of the free market model, a model that can only exist by cannibalism. The last phase of that model was auto-cannibalism of the American economy through creation of a financial bubble in home ownership of average Americans. The decision was made gradually. It began a debate in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq to turn on the one part of the world that had largely remained separate from the control of New York and London banks and their predator corporations, namely the Arab world. And what was launched under the name of the Arab Spring 3 years ago in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Yemen, in Libya, and other countries in the Islamic world, is part of an initiative, according to James Baker, who made a slip of the tongue on a television interview, to do in the Islamic world, from Afghanistan, Pakistan, down through the entire Middle East, Syria, Egypt, across all the way to Morocco, to do to those Islamic countries what was done by the IMF to the former communist countries of Eastern Europe and Russia. Namely, pressure them to enter the game of the free market, the so-called neoliberal. There's nothing liberal about it except for the banks, who liberally take the profits. But to open these economies, these dictatorships, these monarchies, these sheikdoms of the oil-rich Islamic world, with trillions and trillions of dollars of resources and treasures, to open them to further looting. But there's another element of this. The sovereign wealth funds were one of the targets. The huge resources that were invested from the oil revenues of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and other countries. The state-owned companies in these countries, in Libya, the oil, in Egypt and elsewhere. But the Arab Spring had a deeper agenda, and that's now beginning to emerge. U.S. intelligence services and the U.S. State Department secretly began backing a much more ambitious project using a secret Masonic-like organization called the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood originated in the 1920s, as some of you may know, in Egypt under a fanatical jihadist named Banna. They built a secret underground organization in Egypt to fight against the British, and during the Second World War, the Nazis came into Egypt and recruited the Brotherhood and supported them in the fight against the British, and they found the Nazi ideology quite amenable to their own, apparently. After the war, the Muslim Brotherhood was taken over as a franchise by British intelligence until the British financially were unable to sustain their presence in the Middle East, and turned the franchise over to the CIA, the Americans. Well, when the Brotherhood tried to assassinate a former member who had become the president of Egypt, Gamal Abdel Nasser, a proponent of Arab, pan-Arab socialism, they had to go underground, and the CIA decided to get them out of Egypt and bring them to Saudi Arabia, where they fused with a feudalistic trend of Sunni Islam called Wahhabism to create a new hybrid political Islam with a fundamentalist Sharia ideology, a jihadist ideology, much like the evangelical Christians in America where I grew up, where either you join us or you're the enemy, as George W. Bush himself, a professed evangelical Christian, said about the war on terror. Either you join us or you're against us. So Washington started playing with a very, very dangerous cocktail of religious fanaticism and prepared over a period of years before the events in Tunisia and before the events in Tahrir Square in Cairo. They began training cadre in Washington. They brought organizers from Canvas in Belgrade, the ones who organized the color revolution against Milosevic in 2000. And they began training cadre to create what was the superficial part of the regime change, Washington regime change, namely the youth Twitter revolution or Facebook revolution, the protests in Tahrir Square. Now, these are not purely spontaneous events. They are orchestrated by trained cadre. Canvas is financed by the U.S. government through various NGOs and other things. But the RAND Corporation, which is a Pentagon think tank, R-A-N-D, Research and Development in Washington, developed a strategy they call swarming, like a swarm of bees or insects. And they applied this using the electronics of mobile telephones in Georgia, in 2003, 2004. They applied it in Ukraine, the Orange Revolution. And they tried it in several other places unsuccessfully. They tried it in Russia, they tried it in Belarus. But they developed it successfully in Egypt as the foot soldiers, the youth demonstrations for democracy, that then soon were joined by elements of Mubarak's army that had been convinced by the Pentagon that Mubarak had lost his grip and had to go. So some ambitious generals in Mubarak's army turned coat, went to Washington during the outbreak of the protests, and let the thing unravel to the critical point where they intervened. Now, Washington dictated to the military that they should allow elections as early as possible, really early, knowing full well the only organized political force in the country after so many years of Mubarak dictatorship was the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, that was Washington's design from the beginning. Most of the advisors in and around the Obama White House, the key personnel in the State Department, are either directly members of the Muslim Brotherhood or are sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood and in liaison with them. So they forced early elections in Egypt, knowing that the democratic opposition would be in disarray, which they were. They had no time to organize structure, precinct organizations and campaigns. So, not surprisingly, the Muslim Brotherhood won the election and dominated the new parliament, together with some radical Islam parties. But the military thought that they had organized it in a way that they would control Morsi and make sure that they had the veto power on anything the Brotherhood would try. Well, that lasted a few short weeks before Washington again intervened and said, Morsi, we will back you if you repeal all of these military controls. So for more than 1 year now, Egypt has suffered under the Muslim Brotherhood rule of Mohammed Morsi and friends until last. Well, after the brutal military action in Libya to destroy that country, not just Gaddafi, but that country, the U.S. decided to move on to Syria. This is a long-term plan. It's been on the Pentagon war map for at least a decade, to change the political map of the Middle East. And they thought they could roll into Syria on the momentum of Libya and destroy the al-Assad regime and bring in a Muslim Brotherhood opposition in Syria. Well, Syria is a country, if you look on the map behind me, it's a country with many different religious minorities. Druze, Sunni is the majority, Alawite is a minority, Bashar al-Assad is an Alawite, his wife is a Sunni, and you have the Kurds. For many, many years, Syrian friends of mine have assured me, all different religious groups lived together side by side in a society that was basically secular. There was no Alawite belief being forced on the Sunni majority by al-Assad or his father. And suddenly Syria was under attack. Now, if you go to the next slide, the next overhead, you'll see the critical location of Syria geopolitically in the Middle East. Syria borders Turkey, it borders Israel, it borders Lebanon, it borders Iraq. And in 2011, Bashar al-Assad's government signed a contract with the government of Iran and the government of Iraq to build a gas pipeline from the South Pars gas field, the largest gas field known in the world today, so that Iran could market its gas through Iraq, whose prime minister is a Shia Muslim, and through Syria, whose prime minister is an Alawite, but on friendly terms with both Iraq and with Iran. Iranian natural gas potentially, ultimately, into the European market, either through port locations in Syria or through Lebanon. Now, it begins at this point to get very geopolitically complicated, but basically, when that agreement was announced by the Syrian government, the US and NATO allies organized a massive, dramatic escalation of the destruction of the al-Assad regime, accusing al-Assad of terrorism, accusing him of civilian atrocities, everything, the usual playbook that is used by the State Department to demonize anyone they don't like. But in reality, the factor of this new pipeline created a major geopolitical challenge, not just to the United States, but interestingly enough, to Israel, which in 2010 had discovered a huge, for the first time in Israeli history since 1948, a huge offshore gas field called Leviathan in the eastern Mediterranean. And Israel began nursing ambitions of becoming an energy superpower, tiny little Israel, which hadn't had any energy to speak of its own until then. So together with an American company, Noble Energy, an Israeli-American consortium began developing the Leviathan field, and another Middle East country called Qatar also began emerging as a major exporter of liquefied natural gas from another part of the field in the Persian Gulf that's adjoining to the Iranian field. Unfortunately, I don't have a map to show that. But the same gas field that was discovered in Iranian exclusive economic zone waters in the Persian Gulf extends over to Qatar. And the Qataris, with the help of the British energy companies, developed the liquefied natural gas technology to market this to Asia and ultimately to Western Europe. So, not surprisingly, much of the financing for the mercenaries, and they're not opposition for the most part. These are mercenaries. I was in Tehran in February of this year and interviewed a number of journalists who'd spent months all across Syria interviewing mercenaries, Al-Qaeda, and others fighting against the regime. They are paid $100 a day, which is a king's fortune for many of these poor, unemployed people from they're coming from Chechnya, they're coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Libya, where they had excellent combat experience. And they're given Kalashnikovs and $100 a day and told to go in from the Turkish border into Iraq and create terror. And that through the chaos and terror, they're told, we'll back you up and create a regime change against this evil Bashar al-Assad regime. So the financing to the tune of some $5 billion for these mercenary terrorists came from the Emir of Qatar. The Emir of Qatar also houses the headquarters internationally of the Muslim Brotherhood. And it shouldn't be surprising that the leadership of the Syrian opposition, so-called, are all Muslim Brotherhood, or most of them. So this operation ran into a very unexpected resistance when the president of Russia and the Chinese government and the government of Iran, but particularly President Putin here in Russia, drew a deep line in the sand on the Syrian border and said, we will not permit this illegal process of war against an established regime. This is not something we can support under the United Nations Charter. It's a violation of every precept of international law, and we will not allow another Libya to take place. Well, Russia has very good geopolitical reasons for doing so in terms of its own defense, namely the spread of Islamic terror, political Islam, into Chechnya, into Dagestan, and across Central Asia, the Caucasus and so forth, as far east as Xinjiang province in China, which has a large Islamic population. So that was something that the cocky strategists in the Pentagon and the State Department apparently had not counted on. And they attempted to put the massive pressure of the international media, the Western media, on Russia and China for refusing to approve a UN resolution for a no-fly zone in Syria. When that didn't work, they tried to farm the thing out to Prime Minister Erdogan in Turkey, counting on the fact that Turkey and the AKP party, the Islamic party in Turkey, which is affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood and receives considerable financing from U.S. allies in the Arab world, would do what Washington told and be the outsourced maker of the war against Syria, its neighbor. Well, Erdogan, being unpredictable, but being a political realist of a certain strange sort, soon realized that 23% of his own Turkish population were Alawite Muslim. And they were not so happy about the fact that Turkey suddenly turned on its friend it had previously had a no enemies as neighbors policy, so-called, and suddenly they made an enemy out of Syria for no good reason. Syria had not made any threats against Turkish sovereignty. They had not made any military challenges to Turkey. But suddenly the Erdogan government was making extremely aggressive noise that Bashar al-Assad had to go. And not only that, it was providing training grounds, bases inside Turkey across the Syrian border to send mercenaries, terrorists into Syria. However, Erdogan pulled back from the ultimate action which Washington had hoped for, namely a full-scale Turkish military attack on Syria. He realized that that would explode not only the entire of Syria into chaos, but Turkey as well. So he pulled back from that, and Russia, China, and Iran maintained their rock-hard resistance to any U.S. agenda for Syria. They insisted on a diplomatic solution, and still do, I think quite rightly so. Your foreign minister Lavrov has said that repeatedly, with undying patience. And Washington keeps trying to play tricks. The Obama administration comes up with a faked propaganda campaign about chemical weapons, when the United Nations independent investigation shows, if anything, chemicals were used by the mercenary opposition inside Syria against government troops. So there's no verifiable, independently verifiable proof that the Bashar al-Assad government has used chemical weapons, but that was cited by Obama as a justification for providing arms into the rebels or the mercenaries, so-called opposition, and escalating the entire conflict, which is expected to reach a serious escalation by August, September of this year. Well, what's happened in the meantime, through Russian support, through international support, and through a realization by many Syrians themselves that the alternative to Bashar al-Assad, as annoying as his dictatorship might have been, doesn't look much better. In fact, it looks much scarier, and that is political chaos a fanatical religious regime that would do something similar to what Morsi was trying to impose in Egypt. And when video YouTubes were shown of the atrocities against civilians in various Syrian cities carried out, not by the army, that makes no sense for them to kill their own civilians, but by the mercenaries, the Al-Qaeda and others, the public support for Assad's regime began to shift. And Assad made a decision sometime toward the end of last year to arm the civilians in the villages of Syria and create civilian militias, as you have in Switzerland, as you have in Iran, other countries. Because the people who live in these villages know who's a stranger and who's not, who they can trust as a neighbor and who not. And when these terrorists come in, I was told what they do is random killing of women and children, and then through that they terrorize. If you tell any government forces that we're here, we will destroy you all. Well, that regime of terror began to break when the villages were armed, the citizens were armed, and it meant that their government trusted them enough to give them guns, the opposite of what Obama is trying to do in the US, but that's a quite other debate or discussion. And the support, the continued support internationally of Russia, as well as the support of Iran advising some of the Syrian military and others on tactics and strategy to combat this irregular warfare, has resulted in a shift of the situation on the ground to the point where if there's not a massive NATO bombing of Syria, the government will be able to reestablish control over most of the land of Syria within 3 to 6 months by informed estimates. If that happens, and then we have in Egypt an ouster of the Muslim Brotherhood, we have in Turkey something that the US is desperately trying to steer in a way that keeps the AKP party in power but gets rid of Erdogan, who didn't quite do what Washington wanted. The outbreak of protest across Turkey was directed against everything the AKP has tried to impose in the last 10 years. The rolling back of the Ataturk reforms, the Kemal Ataturk reforms from the 1920s, which turned Turkey from a sultanate, a religious sultanate, into a secular state with European legal system and many modern hallmarks of Western society. And young Turkish intellectuals grew up in that Western tradition and were not at all overjoyed about the attempt, step by step, by Erdogan's government to introduce Islamic Sharia in Turkey. So the U.S. operation to use Turkey as a model to spread political Islam through Central Asia is also being put under enormous stress. So I think at this point the Syrian situation might be seen by future historians as a major turning point in a Washington strategy to use political Islam as a weapon, not against communism as they did in Afghanistan, but against the emergence of the only economic challenge that Washington sees to the role of America as the sole superpower, namely the nations of Eurasia. So the aim of this entire strategy, the arc of crisis from Afghanistan down through Libya, is to create chaos in Russia, chaos around Russia, and chaos between China and Russia that would prevent the development of a Eurasian economic union. Well, it would also disrupt the Chinese oil flows from Africa and the Middle East, and it would disrupt various pipelines that Russia would build toward Europe, the South Stream especially. from Gazprom. And so the ultimate aim of this political operation with the Muslim Brotherhood and Al-Qaeda on the part of Washington is to create this arc of crisis that Brzezinski called it in the 70s across the Islamic world, but directed not only inwardly in the Islamic world, but against Russia and China and the Eurasian economies. So the counterpoint to this is the emergence of step by step of a Eurasian space, an economic space. The first foreign trip that President Xi made in China in April as the new president of China was not to Washington, as one might have expected toward the country where most of Chinese economic activity is focused in the last 30 years, but to Russia to meet with President Putin. Number 9 on China's list of priorities of foreign visits was the United States, where President Xi finally met Obama in a catastrophic meeting from the standpoint of U.S. foreign image with President Xi in California some 2.5, 3 weeks ago. The creation of economic infrastructure between China, Russia, Iran, what I call the iron triangle of resistance to the globalization steamroller of the United States, is probably the most important resistance point in the world today against creation, and I use these words very carefully, not of globalization, but globalization is another term for global fascism. Advisors of Bush and also of Obama have worked for decades on what they call the creation of universal fascism under the name of spreading democracy. The closer cooperation between China and Russia especially, and increasingly with Iran added to that, are destabilizing the timetable of Washington significantly. How that will resolve, we will know much better in the next 6 to 12 months. But at this point, it's a tectonic power struggle between East and West. There's a new element that's been added to the equation in the last 3 to 4 years, and that has been a massive propaganda campaign out of Washington and out of the U.S. generally about America's emergence as a new Saudi Arabia through the shale oil and gas revolution, in quotes. There's only one problem with the shale revolution, aside from the fact that the technology necessarily pours millions and millions of gallons of toxic water under the ground, where it, in many cases through the explosions, contaminates the groundwater that people use to drink or to feed their cattle in America. The shale gas is gas that's embedded in shale rock. It's not conventional gas which exists in large deposits underground. So to get it out, they have to blast their way through horizontal pipes under the ground. They have to blast their way with these toxic chemicals and so forth to free the gas from the rock. Well, initially the production of the gas is dramatically high, but unlike conventional gas, which builds up over a slower period of time and declines over a much longer period of time, shale gas, they found, and this has only become evident in the last 2 years, 2.5 years, when there's enough production data available to document this, shale gas reaches a plateau very early and goes dramatically down, something like 87% in the first 2 years. So in order to keep the gas flows going that you have borrowed bank loans to produce, the companies have to keep drilling new wells and keep pouring new infusions of chemicals into the ground to get more gas out. So it's hugely expensive. And ultimately, produced so much shale gas at the beginning to keep their relation with the banks intact that they collapsed. They cut themselves in their own throat. They collapsed the price of natural gas in America, and the companies moved instead to shale oil, to get oil out of these shale rocks. Well, in parts of the United States, in North Dakota and Montana and Texas, they've extracted something like an additional 1.3, 1.4 million barrels of oil per day through shale. However, 1.4 million barrels of oil, new oil a day from shale, is not about to make America a new Saudi Arabia. Merely a Washington propaganda to try to create an image that America is going to be energy independent. What they're trying to do is promote this shale revolution in countries like China for gas, and in Russia for oil, and Ukraine also. But this is probably the least economical way to find oil and gas, and perhaps one of the more destructive ways. Russian scientists, geophysicists, and chemists, beginning in the 50s, under military secrecy in the Moscow State University and various geological institutes here in Moscow, developed a methodology to understand how hydrocarbons, oil, gas, coal, are actually formed, what the genesis of hydrocarbons is. And they looked at Western geophysics, geology rather. They studied all the scientific papers from the West, from US and Britain, and began laughing at the lack of any scientific explanation for the genesis of oil and gas. The idea that it came from fossil fuels is ludicrous if you think about it. How many dinosaurs would congregate in Saudi Arabia to create the oil that's been produced in Saudi Arabia in one giant field alone since 1948? You would need, they calculated, to create a dinosaur cube, dead dinosaurs, assuming they transformed pound for pound 100% into oil from dead dinosaurs. The cube would be 19 miles wide, 19 miles high, and 19 miles deep, only for that one giant field in Saudi Arabia. Why don't the dinosaurs roam in other parts of the earth as intensely as that? Well, algae doesn't explain it either, nor do dead leaves or grass. So they began looking for other explanations and came up with a hypothesis which since has been proven rigorously in repeated experiments in the laboratory, that oil originates in the deep core of the earth, a giant oven that's constantly burning, creating methane gas that through high temperature and pressure is forced through the mantle of the earth in tiny cracks or fissures, migration channels, up toward the surface where it's trapped in air pockets or pockets of rock until it can be found. And they developed a radical revolutionary way of mapping just where to look for oil and gas. And the problem is, after the end of the Cold War, Western oil companies in the United States had no interest in having this technology known to the world, because countries like China, that are controlled through their dependency on Western oil, would suddenly become energy independent. There's resistance by Lukoil and some of the Russian companies to develop this because they fear that there would be a glut of oil on the world market and the price of oil would collapse. Well, I think that's short-term thinking on the part of Lukoil. I know this from a Russian geophysicist friend of mine who's involved in the abiotic project, as they call it. But what they found is that oil is constantly being renewed from deep in the earth. So if you drill too fast, that the oil cannot refill at the same rate it's being extracted, then it appears that the field is run dry. If you close it and come back 25 years later, as they've done in Tatarstan very recently, those fields have magically refilled. So what are the dinosaurs doing? Are they reproducing in the afterlife? So there are known technologies to extract what's believed to be thousands, if not millions of years of natural gas and perhaps of petroleum as well, without destroying the environment for political reasons or geopolitical reasons. That's not being allowed to develop, and the U.S. rather is encouraging China to develop shale gas. Now, where is China's shale gas? It's in Sichuan province, one of the most active earthquake zones in the world, where they had a tragic earthquake back, I believe it was 2008 or 2009. And so to begin drilling for shale gas in Sichuan province, in the earthquake regions where the shale is located, and injecting millions and millions of gallons of water filled with toxic chemicals, not only takes precious water from agriculture and urban uses in Sichuan, but it also creates explosions that have been documented in places. I grew up in Dallas, Texas. We never had an earthquake in Dallas until they began drilling for shale all around the city. And then they began having earthquakes. The same thing in England and other places, in Pennsylvania. So the last thing China needs is shale gas. They have abundant gas, domestic and offshore China, abundant gas, through conventional means if they apply the right technology to find it. The U.S. doesn't, of course, want them to do that. So the shale revolution is a myth created partly by the Wall Street propaganda. It was a great way for Wall Street to make billions and tens of billions of dollars financing this myth, but it is not a solution to the world energy crisis. I understand that Gazprom is going into shale technology simply so that they're aware of what the reality is. I think on one level that's wise, but they shouldn't stake the future of Gazprom on resources from shale gas. And if they study closely the American experience and why the major American energy companies are selling their properties, their shale properties, to foreign investors who are foolish enough to buy it, they're selling it not because it's so good, but because they desperately need money and they know it's not as good as they had hoped at the beginning. Thank you.